Welcome to the Envoy of Venice, a newsletter and podcast focusing on international politics. In this week's episode, the focus is on the background of Israel's escalation in Gaza. An analysis by Mate Salai. In recent weeks, the Israeli leadership has taken further decisions regarding the Gaza war that have been heavily criticized internationally. Despite Hamas having accepted a partial ceasefire and hostage release agreement previously circulated by the U.S. Special Envoy, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu focused instead on preparing an attack on Gaza City. With this, he once again made it clear that the destruction of Hamas and bringing the Gaza Strip under military control are prioritized over the liberation of hostages. Although such decisions are often driven by domestic political considerations, since some members of Israel's ruling coalition, which includes far-right parties, reject any notion of a ceasefire, their foreign policy consequences are extensive. The Gaza crisis has already severely undermined Israel's international standing, especially due to its protraction, the dismissal of criticism regarding genocide and other war crimes, and the failure to meaningfully address the humanitarian situation. The expansion of fighting in Gaza may not be a turning point, but it does mark another milestone in this process. The maximalist security strategy pursued by the Israeli government not only raises serious international legal and moral concerns, but could also lead Netanyahu's government and Israel into diplomatic dead ends. Even if one accepts and understands Israel's current security concerns and threat perceptions, it cannot be claimed that the present course of action is effective. The context of new decisions taken by the Israeli government. Following Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7, 2023, the Israeli government understandably made a fundamental shift in its Gaza policy. The liberation of hostages and the restoration of Israel's deterrence capacity were legitimate goals. In the early stages of the war, Israel placed enormous military pressure on Hamas, resulting in the first ceasefire agreement at the end of 2023, under which 50 hostages were freed. Afterwards, however, it became clear that the Israeli government was not seeking compromise, but intended to annihilate Hamas entirely, even if this meant rendering the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. Following the early-year ceasefire agreement, the government first decided to occupy 75% of the territory, and now it is moving to impose military control over Gaza City, which had not yet been fully occupied, and is still home to an estimated 800,000 people. In parallel, the Israeli government has tried to increase humanitarian aid, but these remain largely symbolic measures. The level of assistance still lags behind pre-war levels, and the U.S.-Israeli aid mechanism set up independently of the UN continues to operate chaotically. At the same time, new debates have emerged concerning civilian casualties. A recent investigation by The Guardian and the Israeli-Palestinian magazine Plus 972 published an analysis on leaked Israeli documents suggesting that 83% of war casualties were civilians. While the methodology and figures are already disputed by many in Israel, Palestinian authorities estimate around 60,000 deaths, while other assessments place the number at 100,000 to 200,000. Whatever the figure, it is clear that the majority of those killed were not Hamas fighters, whose numbers before October 2023 were estimated at about 20,000, though they have since recruited more. Urban warfare naturally and unfortunately leads to high civilian casualties, but this does not mean Israel lacked alternatives or that other options do not still exist. According to an analysis by the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies, the government has 3 scenarios to choose from: continuing and expanding the war, accepting a ceasefire aligned with Hamas's interests, or shifting to a war of attrition. In the latter scenario, the Israeli army would maintain a military presence in Gaza but carry out only limited, targeted operations. Comparing the advantages and disadvantages of these three paths, the author concludes that the first, escalation, is the most harmful and must be avoided, as it endangers hostages, fuels domestic divisions, increases Israel's isolation, inflicts massive humanitarian damage, and still does not guarantee Hamas's defeat. Israel as both David and Goliath. Despite internal and external opposition, the Israeli government has nevertheless chosen this strategy. On August 21st, some Gaza residents already received evacuation orders, and initial steps were taken in the suburbs. Major operations may follow in September, after the planned mobilization of around 60,000 reservists. In parallel, the government has not responded to Hamas's proposal, but maintains the appearance of negotiations, seemingly more as a response to the mass protests in Tel Aviv, with hundreds of thousands attending, than as a genuine effort. Beyond the aforementioned domestic factors, two foreign and security policy principles likely shape government behavior. The first is the need to restore deterrence, which ties into long-standing security concerns and debates since Israel's founding. Israeli strategic culture has traditionally combined a sense of strength with a sense of weakness. Weakness because the country has been surrounded by hostile states since 1948 and has experienced national traumas like the unexpected 1973 war or the deadly Second Intifada. Strength because it has repeatedly defeated neighbors, held its own against Iran and its allies, and built one of the world's most effective militaries with U.S. support and intelligence. Over the past 2 years, both strength and weakness have remained part of Israel's outlook. After the October 7th attack, shock and vulnerability dominated. But the destruction of Gaza, the pushback against Hezbollah, and the 12-day war with Iran all suggested that the regional balance of power had tilted in Israel's favor. To outsiders, this strength seems obvious, yet from the Israeli perspective, fear of Hamas and concern for hostages' survival continue to shape thinking and drive support for harsh measures. A recent analysis used the David and Goliath analogy to describe the situation. Israel, once widely perceived and self-perceived as David, is now increasingly seen in the region as Goliath. It no longer needs to prove it can deter or defeat its enemies. In fact, these actions only alienate potential partners. The irreversible occupation of Palestine. The second foreign policy goal embraced by at least part of the current government is the irreversible occupation of Palestinian territories. The far-right parties and politicians in the coalition are not primarily concerned with hostages, but instead exploit the situation to block Palestinian statehood, prepare for the resettlement of Gaza, and bring more West Bank territory under Israeli control. Since the outbreak of war, Israel has taken control of more West Bank land than in any other period in decades. The number of violent attacks against Palestinians has also risen sharply, with roughly 5 times as many Palestinians killed in 2023 to 2024, as in 2022 to 2023, 2022. These actions have been carried out partly by the army and partly by settlers. In recent days, another critical step was taken when the government approved the long-debated E1 settlement project. This plan, on the agenda for decades, would establish more than 3,000 housing units east of East Jerusalem, effectively cutting the West Bank in two and making a contiguous Palestinian state impossible. Which goal Prime Minister Netanyahu considers more important largely depends on his political interests. Currently, the coalition is under more strain than before, leading him to concede more to extremist parties. What he would do if he were not dependent on coalition partners is impossible to know. Like most politicians, his primary goal is likely to remain in power, even if this involves prolonging the Gaza crisis and deepening Israel's diplomatic impasse. This situation will be very difficult for Israel to escape, since both foreign policy aims not only draw widespread international criticism, but also fail to strengthen Israel's position in the Middle East. I hope you enjoyed our show. If so, please follow us on the platform you are listening to our podcast and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack, theenvoyofvenice.substack.com. Until next time.